visit. I'm very pleased to be coming back to the Jane Austen Society, for which we spoke, I think, back in 2009, and that was long ago. And it was a very fleeting visit too, because I was still teaching, so I'm having a slightly more relaxed stay here now. I've finished teaching. I got very interested in Jane Austen's unfinished texts a few years ago, and I started to speculate about why she left them as they were, and there are various reasons for that. I guess with Sanditon it's probably the most obvious one, which is that she didn't survive to complete that one. But the Watsons, I think, is particularly fascinating because we're fairly sure that it was written in about 1803, possibly 1804, and then abandoned after that, and there's no real discussion of it in the Austen family or in Jane's letters. Even the title was not her title, though it may well have been had she advanced with it. It was given the title by the Austen family, and it's actually quite a suitable title because if you've read it, you'll know that it is a text that's very centred on a particular family. It got known in the public domain because James Edward Austen Leigh mentioned some of the unpublished works in his memoir of Jane Austen, and then in 1869, 1870, and then he published the Watsons in the next edition. It's an interesting manuscript too, because it's got lots of changes made to it and lots of crossings out and additions, and I'll say something about those but not go into that in as much detail as I do in my book, so because that's the sort of thing that's hard to talk about in detail orally. But as I said, the date is probably about 1803 or 04 because there's a watermark of 1803 on the paper. And the dating comes down also from Jane Austen's great niece, Fanny Caroline Lefroy, who was the daughter of Anna Lefroy, née Austen, whom you'll know was Austen Leigh's half-sister and the daughter of her eldest brother, James. And she probably took the dating from Cassandra, who owned the manuscript. The Watsons is the bleakest of the texts that I talk about in my book. The heroine, Emma Watson, begins the story in a newly dispossessed state when the household, which has where she's been brought up since the age of 5 and made of her an assumed heiress, falls apart. This is the household of her childless aunt and uncle Turner, but when the uncle dies, the aunt marries a Captain O'Brien, who then is entitled to the inheritance that Mrs. Turner has had, and then more or less ejects Emma and sends her back to her family home. Okay, so going back to the Watsons, there are 5 other siblings, and plus a clergyman father who is ailing and looks as if he's going to die soon. Only the elder son is financially secure as a lawyer. The younger son is a surgeon's apprentice, and the 3 older daughters are all unmarried and mostly wishing to be so. And one of the theories about why she abandoned the story is that her own situation became somewhat like that of what was probably going to happen to Emma Watson, because at the beginning of 1805, the Reverend George Austen died and left his widow and the 2 single daughters in difficult financial circumstances. So here indeed then are the Watson siblings, approximate ages. We know Emma's 19, Sam is 2 years older, Elizabeth's 28. It's implied that Robert is the oldest, and then you've got the 2 middle sisters obviously between 28 and 21. So what's happening when Emma has to come home is that 2 siblings are away, and in fact they don't appear in the story as characters. One is Penelope, the second daughter, who's staying with a friend and hoping to snare as a husband the friend's elderly uncle. and then Dr. Harding, and then Sam, no longer as an apprentice surgeon, lives at home, but he's linked into the story because he's in love with Mary Edwards, who is the only child and wealthy heiress of a family that their Watsons are friendly with. And Emma Watson, in fact, travels to and from the local assembly ball with the Edwards family because the Watson family don't have a carriage. Just, if you're thinking about Jane Austen in 1803, her father's still alive, but her attempts to get published aren't going anywhere. This is the year that her brother Henry sold a precursor of Northanger Abbey called Susan to Benjamin Crosby for £10, but it was not published, and she ended up buying it back in 1816. The other thing that had happened was that First Impressions, the original of Pride and Prejudice, had gone to a publisher in 1797 but was turned down. So her efforts to publish were not getting anywhere, and of course we know that she didn't end up publishing anything till Sense and Sensibility several years later. However, on the subject of continuation, there was a family story that Cassandra knew the guts of the plot or what was going to happen. The Reverend Watson was soon to die, and Emma was to have to just go and stay with her brother Robert and sister-in-law Jane, who are pretty repellent people, as I'll go on to illustrate. However, there have been suitors on the scene for Emma, and again they appear in the fragment. The local grandee, Lord Osborne, and his former tutor, the Reverend Howard. And one complication was to be that although Emma was attracted to Mr. Howard, and he was going to be her final husband, the Dowager Lady Osborne was after him as well. It's kind of interesting, but that's not really featured in what she left, but may well have been. And Lord Osborne was a significant suitor. At the local assembly, which I mentioned, she meets the Lord Osborne and Mr. Howard, as well as the local cad, Tom Musgrave. She draws this coward's attention because Lord Osborne's sister, Miss Osborne, reneges on a promise to dance with Charles Blake, who is the 10-year-old son of the widow Mrs. Blake, who is the sister of Mr. Howard. So that's how she gets to meet the family. Okay, so I wanted to stress, though, at the point we get to in the fragment, is that Emma's financial situation is fairly grim because there's no money in the family except what Robert has, and he is very resentful that when their father dies, he'll become responsible for the unmarried sisters. Now, as far as Howard is concerned, he is represented very positively, though rather sketchily, and Emma is attracted to him immediately. She thinks he's good looking, but he also has a sensible and unaffected way of expressing himself. And the fact that she's interested in him emerges in one of the additions that Jane Austen made to the manuscript, where Tom Musgrave calls on the Watson family and plays cards with them, and Emma asks him whether he sees much of the parsonage family, Mr. Howard, etc., at Osborne Castle, but then there's a distraction and she doesn't feel she can press the subject. Howard also turns up at a visitation, which is to do with a bishop visiting. He's a clergyman, Mr. Watson's a clergyman. They meet at this occasion, and Mr. Howard helps the frail Mr. Watson to go up some stairs. And Mr. Watson recalls that, he asked after one of my daughters, but he didn't know which one, So, one evident concern in the text is to distinguish Howard from Lord Osborne. He's quite gauche, and also arrogant. He hangs around Emma at the ball without asking her to dance, but he gets, later he and Musgrave doing the thing, suitors or dance partners used to sometimes visit the women they dance with after the ball. So he goes off with Musgrave and visits the Watsons. And he just all the way through appears, until a crucial moment, he appears quite a repellent figure. He kind of hangs round the ball scene without talking to people or being polite. And it's implied that he really only turns up because he wants to, stand for election and win the election. And then when the supper comes on, he goes and sits at a long distance far away, partly to keep up his own thoughts, but also, as we're told, to gape, that is, yawn, without restraint. However, he is at the scene of one of the most striking scenes in the fragment, and another place where Austen put in a revision. So he indulges in awkward gallantry, recommending that Emma wear half boots because they show off a neat ankle. Emma explains such boots are not suitable for country walking. Osborne then recommends that she ride because a woman never looks better than on horseback. But Emma has to point out that every woman may not have the inclination or the means. Osborne's riposte is that if they knew how much it became them, they would all have the inclination. And I fancy Miss Watson, when once they had the inclination, the means would soon follow. So this is what she has to say. Your Lordship thinks we always have our own way. That is a point on which ladies and gentlemen have long disagreed, but without pretending to decide it, I may say that there are some circumstances which even women cannot control. Female economy will do a great deal, my lord, but it cannot turn a small income into a large one. So Lord Osborne is rather taken aback by this, and we're told that he now addresses Emma with a degree of considerate propriety because it was a new thing with him to wish to please a woman. It was the first time that he'd ever felt what was due to a woman in Emma's situation. Kind of interesting, and you can probably see where I'm going with in relation to Pride and Prejudice. But one thing about this story is that things kind of happen quite quickly. And so you're getting the encounters between Emma and Lord Osborne, and Lord Osborne's been made out to be quite arrogant and gauche. And then he has this conversation. She finds a tactful way of drawing attention to her lack of resources, and then he gets the point and is quite polite. There's another suitor on the scene, or could be a suitor, called Tom Musgrave. He's really something of a cad, something I'll come back to too. He works through the Osborne girls, as it were. So he has courted in turn Elizabeth, Penelope, Margaret, and now he's got his eyes on Emma, and that's of course why he comes and visits. And he is also presented as rather crass. He's first seen at the inn where the ball is in morning dress and boots. Why is this important? Because he's meant to be going to a ball, and so he should be getting dressed in proper attire. Why is he doing this? Because behaving as he is, well, he won't actually get dressed properly attired until the Osbornes turn up. It's all about kowtowing to the Osborne family. And in general, he's quite, he's not gross, but he's just arrogant and the sort of person who has never really been forced to confront his own deficiencies. And within the text itself, within the text that we've got it, he doesn't ever have to do that. Now, getting on to the money again, when the fragment ends, there's no further encounter in sight between Emma and Mr. Howard, and Sam Watson's marital desires to wed Mary Edwards, which I don't think are represented as a fortune-hunting venture. He's not after her money. He's somebody who's known her from childhood, and it's clear that she's also got some interest in him. But that's got nowhere by the end of the fragment. And Robert and Margaret, the other two siblings who appear, Margaret is being away to stay with Robert and Jane because she thinks her absence will make Tom Musgrave's ardour grow more powerful. But of course, there's no real ardour there. And so Robert himself is somebody who you might think with the opportunities open to men has succeeded. He's a solicitor, but I mean he's married the daughter of his former employer and got her money. So there's no sense that he's a man of great talent. Robert is generally fairly arrogant and is very critical of the situation that he's in as the only member of the family with any sort of financial resources. So the story is implicitly asking how a young woman like Emma Watson, who is represented as educated, she's intelligent, she's sensitive, but the people that she sees around her, and including most of her own family, are not very congenial. A. Walton Litz argues that the story's theme is the conflict between the free spirit and socio-economic imperatives. And of course it does, by putting the heroine in such a parlous situation, it does raise that question of how is Jane Austen going to manage the romance plot? How is it going to work out? Because it will work out, but once the family have been brought into such a difficult situation comparatively, for their class, how is it going to work out that if Howard is the destined husband, that's actually going to happen? And if it does happen, then will it look implausible because there'll be such a change in her circumstances? Like, saying a bit more about Robert, the two siblings that she talks to a fair bit are Robert and Elizabeth. And the situation of Elizabeth is quite interesting, but I'll just sort Robert out, first of all. Yeah, he disrespects his relatives when he visits by declining to powder his hair, which he should have done. He thinks, I haven't got time and it's only our poor relatives, we don't have to do anything to suit them. So anyway, and then when Tom Musgrave turns up, again, Tom Musgrave is the sort of character who's given to turning up, he wants to talk to Tom Musgrave about politics and what's happening in the public world because Tom has just come back from London. So Robert wants the last current report as the public news, and the general opinion of the day must be understood before Robert could let his attention be yielded to the less national and important demands of the women. So Robert basically, when talking to Emma, attacks or criticises their aunt. It always actually acts as if Mrs. Turner was Emma's aunt, nobody else's aunt, Yeah. And this is what when she tries to defend her aunt, this is what Robert says. But unluckily, she has left the pleasure of providing for you to your father, and without the power. That's the long and short of the business. After keeping you at a distance from your family such a length of time, as must do away all natural affection, and breeding you up, I suppose, in a superior style, you are returned upon their hands without a sixpence. So it's this sort of really repulsive kind of attitude. Everything is about money, and of course he's feeling, once the father dies, it'll be his problem because there's no one else in the family to help out. His wife has manners which are pert and conceited, but at least after Emma's had this interchange with him and Jane comes in, she diverges to praise Jane's outfit because she doesn't want this conversation with Robert going on. Jane is the sort of person who sucks up compliments, so that kind of works. But still, Emma is always with her family in this rather difficult, tired, frustrated state where she can't always say what she wants to. The interactions with Elizabeth are a bit more complex. Elizabeth has ended up the older daughter at home who looks after the father. And in fact, she would normally have gone to the ball, except that Emma was the kind of new arrival, and so she gave up her seat, as it were. And there's this kind of various stories that Elizabeth tells about the lives of her and her other sisters. And she resents Penelope, the next one down, for two reasons. But that she, as Elizabeth puts it, got in the way of an ongoing courtship between Elizabeth and a friend of Robert's called Purvis, and that Penelope tried to get him for herself, but then he went off and married someone else. And then you can tell that Elizabeth is still kind of carrying a torch, as it were, for Tom Musgrave. And she says that he hasn't liked anyone else as much as he liked her, but then he's been working his way through the family and possibly flirting with other women as well. So there's that kind of sense that she's lost Purvis and she feels that Musgrave is still there to be attracted. But part of the issue too in this interchange is that Emma has found Musgrave pretty repulsive, and Elizabeth doesn't get that. She can't understand it. And when they're talking about Musgrave, Emma acts as if Musgrave is irresistible and that Emma will be delighted with him. But Emma's not delighted with him. And so there's that kind of sense, I think, not just of two different personalities, but I think also the sense of Elizabeth, someone who's 28, and she seems to have had the opportunity to meet very few men. And so the men she does meet, she invests a lot of emotion and hope in, whereas Emma is younger, and you get the impression that having lived in a more wealthy and loving household, that she's actually become more mature, although her actual life experience is not as great. But Elizabeth, however, is very much worried about being left single. And Emma criticises the other sisters for husband hunting. She feels shocked by this desperation to be married. And she says, "To be so bent on marriage, to pursue a man merely for the sake of situation, is a sort of thing that shocks me. I cannot understand it." In her view, for a woman of education and feeling, poverty, however painful, is a lesser evil than marrying an unpleasant man. And she says she'd prefer to teach at a school than accept such a fate. But Elizabeth, who's not actually been a school teacher, but she says, "I've been to schools and I know what their lives are like." And so Elizabeth, will settle for any good-humoured man with a comfortable income. Yeah. So again, you've got this whole kind of question keeps arising, what will Emma do in this rapidly changed situation? Will she... It's fairly clear she won't become like Penelope or Margaret, but it's a kind of real question about what happens to women who don't end up marrying. And it's a bit like, not about Pride and Prejudice particularly, but looking forward to, say, a figure like Miss Bates or even Jane Fairfax, that you're not going to marry, so what's your life going to be like if you haven't got financial resources? Okay, well, getting on to Pride and Prejudice. As I said, that text had existed as first impressions, which Mr. Austen had tried to sell to Thomas Cadell without success. It's presumably still around. There's a lot of speculation about the originals of Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility and what Jane Austen did in the intervening period between drafting them and getting them published. Yeah. Okay, so some parallels between Pride and Prejudice and the Watsons. One similarity is suggested by comparing Mr. Watson and Mr. Bennet. Both of them are readers, and in each case that's a bond the father shares with his most intelligent daughter. But each father is negligent as well and takes refuge in reading from social and family duties. In the case of Mr. Watson, that's explained by his ailing state, but there's no reference to his ever having done anything to further his daughter's chances of marriage. And of course there's no mother. And you might think about Mrs. Bennet and think, what kind of a mother she is, but she is, I guess, a mover and shaker. She's wanting things to happen, even if she's not going about it the right way. But there's no sense that Mr. Watson is identifying his having 4 unmarried daughters as a problem in his financial situation. And although Robert Watson is represented as fairly repellent, it is true that he will be the male relative who will have to bear the responsibility for his unmarried sisters. But going back to Pride and Prejudice again, at least the Bennet daughters, although they're not prosperous, have some money from their mother's marriage settlement, so they should each get £1,000, which isn't a big fortune, but it is something. The texts both feature a variety of personality types among their respective groups of sisters. The 5 Bennet girls include 2 man chasers in Kitty and Lydia, but they're differentiated by Lydia's stronger, more confident character. Margaret and Penelope Watson are both husband hunters, but it seems as if Margaret is fretful and peevish, while Penelope is frank and forceful, at least, from what you hear of her. The darker tone of the Watsons is reflected, though, in the husband-hunting sisters' desperation. Unlike Kitty and Olivia Bennet, the Watson daughters have been vainly pursuing men for some years. They and the less self-centred Elizabeth reflect the condition of their family where husband hunting has come to seem a dire necessity. So if you think about Pride and Prejudice, of the sisters themselves sort of consciously thinking about getting married, the only one I think that really feels desperate is Mary, because she's aware of not being as physically attractive, and so she develops the accomplishments. So you've got a similar scenario in Pride and Prejudice, but the daughters are generally younger and they've got a mother for better or worse, and they've got a bit of money behind them. Another link between the two stories, I think, relates to the affinity between Elizabeth Watson and Charlotte Lucas. They're both eldest daughters with little in the way of dowry and have reached their late 20s unmarried. Elizabeth has lost her bloom, while Charlotte has never been considered good-looking. Elizabeth Watson has romantic delusions that Charlotte lacks, but they've both become quite pragmatic about the need to marry. Most importantly, the older women's views in the two novels are at odds with those of emotionally close younger women, Elizabeth Bennet in Charlotte's case and Emma Watson in Elizabeth Watson's case. As we know, Elizabeth Bennet is dismayed and horrified when Charlotte accepts Mr. Collins. As she tells Jane, Mr. Collins is a conceited, pompous, narrow-minded, silly man, so that the woman who marries him cannot have a proper way of thinking, and thus Charlotte is violating principle and integrity. Jane demurs at Elizabeth's strong language, while Charlotte herself has already told Elizabeth that she's never been romantic and seeks only a comfortable home. So that's very much the sort of attitude, although Elizabeth Watson is carrying a couple of torches for unattainable men, she does have this sort of practical attitude that it's better to be married to somebody than to be the single daughter at home. And so that whole issue, I think it sort of threads through Pride and Prejudice, but it's, although the discussion about what cost you would marry happens between Elizabeth and Emma Watson early in the story, it's kind of implicit in the rest of it as well. And of course, in Pride and Prejudice, none of the Bennet daughters are left in poverty-stricken spinsterhood. 3 marry, 2 to wealthy men. Kitty spends, of the unmarried ones, of course, Kitty gets to spend time at Pemberley. Mary mixes more in society. And then, of course, although Mr. Bennet's death and the entail are constantly talked about in the story, you don't get the impression that Mr. Bennet is going to die anytime soon. It becomes a bit of a joke, when Mrs. Bennet says, he says to her, you might die first, But in the Watsons, it seems fairly clear that Mr. Watson is going to die fairly soon. not necessarily the next chapter, but, within the next few chapters. Yeah. And it's also true, I think, that think of Emma Watson and Elizabeth Bennet, who are quite similar in many ways. They've got cheerful spirits and they enjoy reading. But there's that kind of sense with both of them that they've still got difficult situations to master. And that's much more the case, I think, in Emma's situation than in Elizabeth's. Yeah. Okay, well, just going back to Mr. Darcy and Lord Osborne, I think there's a kind of blueprint almost for the relationship between Elizabeth and Darcy in the relationship of Emma Watson and Lord Osborne. But it hasn't really been developed, and I think there's two obvious problems. One is that is Lord Osborne going to be the husband that she ends up with, and in what we've got, it doesn't look like it. It may be, but it doesn't look like it. So then you've got the issue of, well, if Lord Osborne is capable of reform, capable of change, well, what will be the significance of that? If the moral change of Lord Osborne is going to be important to the story, it might well have been going somewhere else, not towards Emma's marriage with him. The other thing is, I think that Emma and Howard are both presented, as we get them, as characters that don't seem to need to change in any obvious way. I mean, there may be a sense that Emma has to become a bit more realistic and a bit less refined in her attitudes and a bit more sympathetic to the situation of her sister Elizabeth. But she doesn't come across as a character who is going to necessarily make lots of mistakes. And that also seems to be the case with Mr. Howard, as far as we're aware of them. I mean, if the story about the continuation or the ultimate end was true, well, there might be a plot device to do with the Dowager Lady Osborne fancying Howard, and you can imagine that could be a kind of difficult and embarrassing situation for the characters. But I guess what I'm getting at here is that there don't seem to be kind of internal pressures or internal, I don't want to sound too moralistic, but there don't seem to be a need for internal development in either Howard or Emma, or at least not enough to sustain a kind of powerful plot motif. Does that make sense? Because in most of the other novels, and it varies, of course, from novel to novel, that you get some kind of change or awareness that develops in the hero and or the heroine. And these two, and also there's a kind of pathos that you might be foreshadowing the situation of Anne Elliot. But then, of course, a lot of the pathos with Anne Elliot is to do with what she didn't do. There's that kind of sense of her being the older woman who made certain choices that have had very significant effects. So although people often see Anne Elliot as a very virtuous figure, she has a kind of pathos to her that I don't think Emma is likely to develop, if you can follow that. Yeah, so I guess what I'm saying about the Watsons is that there are these kind of elements of things that she was to do elsewhere. So there are kind of elements there, and you can see perhaps most obviously in Pride and Prejudice what she did with that, with the basic situation of the family and then the various suitors and what emerges from that. But there's also a kind of sense with Pride and Prejudice that, and I think a lot of people have commented on this, there is and people may not agree, but there is a kind of wish fulfillment element in it. Well, we all barrack for Elizabeth and we want her to end up at Pemberley with a reformed Mr. Darcy. So I think a lot of people, I know it's not in the kind of popular response generally to Pride and Prejudice, but a lot of the critical response has actually looked at the novel as something of a wish fulfillment, or as a kind of endorsement of the upper classes in a way that we may not feel comfortable with. I mean, there's lots of debates about Pride and Prejudice, which I don't want to get into, but I think what's happening with the Watsons is that she's got these two figures who are admirable, but there's a question of, except for putting external barriers in their path, what's she going to do with them? Yeah. Okay, well, talking about what we're going to do with them, there's also the question of, well, does a woman's destiny have to be marriage? And if we look at the completions of the Watsons, which is the last thing I'm going to talk about, I did a fair bit of work on those, and I'm not going to talk about them in detail, but my general sense was that the blueprint that seemed to come from Jane Austen, which was the idea that Howard was going to end up Emma's husband, she'd get a proposal from Lord Osborne, and the barrier between Howard and Emma, apart from Lord Osborne, was going to be Lady Osborne, the Dowager, who was going to be after him. All that was something that the other completions in general tend to iron out. The other thing they tend to iron out is the initial cause of Emma's relative poverty, which is Aunt Turner's marriage. So there can be ways of getting rid of a husband, the awful husband. I mean, it was not easy back in those days to get rid of the husband you didn't want, but novelists who wanted to restore Emma's wealth or help Emma out financially would get rid of Captain O'Brien in some way. Now, what I'm leading up to is the text that I find, for me it's a text, I've never seen it as a play. It's the play called The Watsons by Laura Wade, and I'm feeling jealous of Penny Gay in this respect because it was on in Chichester in 2018, and Penny Gay happened to be there, and I wasn't. And then it moved in 2019 to a place called Minier's Chocolate Factory in London. Sounds a bit like kind of off-Broadway, I'm not sure. But it was going to move in 2020 to the West End. And what happened in 2020? And as far as I can tell, it hasn't been reproduced. I keep hoping that it'll come back, but it doesn't look as if it will. Yeah. So what Laura Wade does with this is to actually question the whole notion of completing in the 21st century a novel written published in the 19th. The play begins with a dramatic adaptation of what Austen wrote, using many of her words but condensing the text. And there's a lot of dialogue in it, so that wasn't too tough. She also noted, Laura Wade noted, that there's a contrast between Emma's proto-feminist feistiness and the dreary situation in which Austen leaves her. So we get in the play, you get to the part that Jane Austen left it at. So there is Laura Wade, and you might know her partner, Sam West. So he's just been in the Vet series. He's been in that, yeah. He's been in quite a few things. In fact, I saw him as playing one of the Midsummer Murders. He was in an episode where there was a kind of Jane Austen theme park, and his character was playing a romantic lead but had to conceal the fact that he was gay. So it's kind of interesting. Anyway, so that's Laura Wade. The fact that they are not married is important to the play. Okay, so what happens after the scene where Lord Osborne and Tom Musgrave visit the Watsons? Wade inserts an encounter between Emma Watson and Mr. Howard. They meet up as Emma buys provisions for the upcoming visit of the Robert Watsons, who turn up, next scene. But this doesn't foreshadow in any romantic development, for instead of dramatising the long scene where Tom pays an unexpected visit to Stanton, Wade has Lord Osborne turn up again, propose to Emma, and have his proposal accepted. At this point, a woman in servant's garb suddenly calls out, "No!" And this turns out to be the author in disguise. It's not literally Laura Wade, she doesn't play the role every night, but Anyway, so there's the characters. Obviously, it's a comedy with all these people in Jane Austen period gear, but all these sort of odd things like ice creams and headphones and all that sort of stuff, and mobile phones, of course. Yeah. So when told by Laura Wade that she's destined for Mr. Howard, Emma makes it clear that she sees wedding Osborne instead as a way of restoring something like her former life with her aunt and uncle, whereas she would find another parsonage existence mean. Obviously, this highlights the artificiality of the courtship plot that Austen quite consciously uses. And, of course, in Austen's novels, heroines do not marry without affection. However, Laura, the character in the play, does point out that solving the problem through getting rid of Captain O'Brien and then restoring Emma's fortune was not going to be very Jane Austen either. So what do they do? Okay, now the characters, and this is if anyone knows Pirandello's 6 Characters in Search of an Author, they start to rebel there. That's them on stage. And I think the woman with the back to the audience is the Laura Wade character, and Emma Watson's on our left. And if you go into it, you can figure out who all the others are. I think the man at the back is probably Tom Musgrave. But anyway, so they think they can thwart Laura's intentions, but not entirely, because Emma Watson wants to walk out of Stanton, the parsonage, and she can't get anywhere because no one's written that bit yet. Yeah. I mean, the characters remain experientially in the early 19th century, so they're nonplussed by Laura's mobile phone. But they vote to put themselves in charge of the story and adapt quickly to the present. So 10-year-old Charles Blake, remember him, the one that Emma danced with, he masters the mobile. And as you can imagine, they always do, don't they? The characters want to negotiate larger roles for themselves. The Edwardses turn up. They haven't been seen since the ball scene. They turn up. They want more action for them. Tom Musgrave refuses to be simply the cad. Now, Lady Osborne, who's supposed to be in pursuit of Howard, who does she fall for? The nanny, who's a character in the story, who is the Watson's actual servant. So, she wants to have a romance with a woman and a servant, breaking all the boundaries. Yeah. In the end, Margaret gets to marry Lord Osborne. Elizabeth marries Howard. And then Margaret and Emma indulge in energetic sex under a table. Emma's partner in that is an army officer. And the darkness under the furniture is identified as Laura Wade's subconscious. Meanwhile, the issue of who is in charge is framed partly through the characters' discussions of theorists like Thomas Hobbes, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Mary Wollstonecraft. But things soon become chaotic. Robert Watson speaks to Napoleon on the phone, and Aunt O'Brien comes back in a spaceship. Laura Wade literally loses the plot. Okay, but meanwhile, Emma Watson has been interrogating Laura about the story and the role of Jane Austen. And ultimately, Emma doesn't settle for a life centred on a man, in marriage or otherwise. Rather, she decides to become a writer. Laura's view is that Austen didn't finish the Watsons because the kind of ending she wanted for Emma, that is, Austen wanted for Emma, a feminist-inflected one, was not possible in her era. So Laura Wade's play ends with Charles Blake delivering to Emma Watson from Laura a book full of blank pages and a pen. Emma starts to write. The world shimmers with possibility. Now, there's a couple of other things about Laura Wade, the character. She is interrogated because the characters work out she's not married, but they know she's got children, and so there's all that kind of, well, how can that be the case? But of course, the sexual possibilities in the play are going to open out from that. although they didn't get to the West End, Samuel West and Laura Wade fetched up in Oxford, where in fact Samuel West had been a student, and they gave the Bodleian lecture, Friends of the Bodleian Library lecture, and Catharine Sutherland, the Austen scholar, was there. And I think one of the things that Catharine Sutherland said, and I'll see if I can find the YouTube of this, because this was interesting to watch. Catharine Sutherland likened Wade's play to Austen's Juvenilia, where much that happens isn't probable in any text that aims to be true to life to the period. And there's much reversal of traditional gender roles. The teenage Austen used the Juvenilia to try out options that she knew wouldn't pass muster in works that claimed to represent contemporary reality. In Wade's rendering, years after the Juvenilia, Austen abandoned her text of the Watsons because she couldn't imagine any life for her heroine that was both satisfying and plausible. On the other hand, transported into the 21st century by Laura Wade, Emma Watson can both live and write her own future. Thank you.
Wow, if that's a play that comes to Sydney, we'll all be able to see it.
Yeah,
that was so interesting. We've not done a lot on the Watsons in our years of Jazza, and it's been really fascinating today to hear more analysis of what actually is going on in that really interesting text. Does anyone have questions they'd like to ask Joanne?
And actually, perhaps I should say too that one of the interesting things about working on Austen's unfinished text was that their being unfinished means that they're in manuscript, and probably people know that very little of Jane Austen's fictional writing survives, and I think the only thing that's relevant to one of the finished and published novels is the cancelled chapters of Persuasion, because they're great if you haven't encountered them, because you find out how she tried out the ending and then made a lot of decisions about how she was going to complete it. But I just wish there was much more of Jane Austen's actual manuscript material where you've got the published version as well.
It's also interesting, isn't it, to think about the names that she recycles. You know, the Watsons is an unpleasant Robert, and then we get Robert Ferrers. And there's a young brother called Sam, and there's a Sam Price in Mansfield Park, and Emma and Elizabeth, and, you know, all these names get reused in her fiction.
Yeah, because one of the things with the continuations was, one of the initial continuations was done by Jane Austen's niece, via Catherine Hubback, and she and there's a whole kind of family history of people collateral descendants of Austen who write continuations or completions of the Watsons. And in the case of Catherine Hubback and her descendants, they changed the name of Emma to Emily because I suppose they were thinking, well, there is another novel where she used Emma, so we have to have it. Yeah, it's not something different. Yeah.
Another question?
A comment. Samuel West was Mr. Elliot in the Amanda Rouge.
He was.
Oh, right, of course, yeah. I'd forgotten that.
His father, Timothy West, was in, we had it in the last Practicalities time, was he Mr. Wickham, was he, in a very early Pride and Prejudice.
Oh, really?
And Prunella Scales was a Lydia Bennet.
Oh.
So all the West family has lots of interesting Jane Austen film connections. Yes.
Yeah, and Sam West said, you know, because he had done English at Oxford, he actually had read some of the completion, so he was kind of well up in it.
I just want to say Timothy West was Charles Naylor in the 1950-something as well.
Oh, right, okay. Yeah. Charles Naylor, yes. So they've got good Austen credentials.
The go-to family for Austen characters.
And Prunella Scales, Samuel West's mother, did the utterly superb unabridged audio reading of Emma. It was so good. It's, for me, still the best reading of Emma there is. So her Miss Bates was so amazing.
Yeah.
on behalf of Jazza, I'd like to thank you for coming all this way to the talk today.